Look at the map of the world. Every single nation you see is drowning in red ink. The United States is suffocating under a burden of $38 trillion. Japan is crushed by $9 trillion. The entire planet is shackled by a $315 trillion chain, a figure that is 3 times larger than the entire global economy combined. But here is the paradox that should keep you awake at night. If every single country owes money, who is on the other side of the transaction? Who is the creditor? The answer is not what you have been told in school, because when you peel back the layers, when you follow the money to its source, you discover a terrifying reality. The world does not owe money to a specific person or a rival planet. It owes money to itself. But this is not an accident. It is a cage. 4 men, across 3 different centuries, built this cage. They designed a financial architecture where debt is mathematically impossible to repay, where governments are forced to borrow until the end of time, and where the wealth of the working class flows eternally upward to the architects of the trap. This is not a theory. This is documented history. The contracts are real. The meetings happened. And once you see the blueprint, you will understand that the $38 trillion debt is not a crisis to them. It is the system working exactly as it was designed. Before we expose the first architect who started this nightmare, if you want to uncover the history they hide from you, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications right now. Join us, because the truth is the only way to break free. Leave a like if you are ready to see the reality behind the curtain. Let's go back to before 1694. In those days, kings borrowed money the old-fashioned way. If a monarch needed gold for war, he went to merchants or nobles and promised to pay them back with interest. If the king ran out of money, he defaulted. The lenders lost their gold, the king suffered embarrassment, but the debt was erased. It was a transaction with a beginning and an end. The system reset itself. But one man changed the rules of the game forever. His name was William Patterson. He was not a king or a general. He was a Scottish merchant who had failed at almost everything he touched. But in 1691, he had a vision that would enslave the future. England was bleeding money in a war against France. King William III was desperate. The treasury was empty, and traditional lenders refused to give him a single coin because England had a history of not paying back its loans. Patterson saw an opportunity. He approached the king with a radical proposal. He would gather a syndicate of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. In today's money, that is a massive fortune. But here was the twist. The innovation that would change human history. Patterson proposed that the loan would never be repaid. The principal amount would stay with the government forever. Instead, the government would only pay interest at a rate of 8% every single year for eternity. To manage this perpetual debt, Patterson founded a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanism was brilliant and diabolical. The merchants gave their gold to the bank. The bank lent it to the king. The king taxed the citizens to pay the interest, and the bank funneled that tax money back to the merchants. Why would the merchants agree to never get their principal back? Because the interest payments were guaranteed by Parliament. As long as the British government had the power to tax its people, the money would flow. It was a guaranteed income stream that would last as long as the nation existed. But Patterson's genius did not stop there. He demanded that the Bank of England be allowed to print paper money backed by this government debt. For every pound the government borrowed, the bank could print banknotes and lend them out again. This was the moment the trap was set. Money was no longer just a store of value. Money became debt. The government's IOU became the currency of the realm. The more the government borrowed, the more money circulated. This created a perverse incentive. To have a growing economy, you needed more money. To get more money, the government had to go deeper into debt. It is a perfect circle for the bankers and a death spiral for the taxpayers. You are not just paying for services, you are paying rent on the money in your pocket. Within just 50 years, every major power in Europe saw the genius of this trap and copied it. France, the Netherlands, and eventually, the newly formed United States followed suit. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Treasury Secretary, looked at the Bank of England and copied it almost exactly. He argued that a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. But for whom was it a blessing? Not for the workers. It was a blessing for the financiers who held the bonds. Patterson died in 1719, but his monster is still alive today. The Bank of England still stands. The debt that England took on to fight wars in the 1700s has never been fully paid off. It has only been rolled over, refinanced, and expanded. Patterson created the foundation. Debt must be permanent, but the system was still local. It needed someone to take it global. It needed a network that could trap entire continents. And that is where the second architect enters the stage. By the early 1800s, governments were addicted to borrowing, but the market was messy. There was no standard system. A loan in Paris was different from a loan in Vienna. Enter Nathan Rothschild. The Rothschild family had already established a banking dynasty, but Nathan was about to industrialize the debt trade. While Patterson created permanent debt, Rothschild created the international bond market. The Rothschild brothers set up 5 banking houses in the power centers of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This was the first multinational financial network. They could move information and gold faster than any government courier. Nathan Rothschild, sitting in London, realized that he didn't just have to lend money to the government. He could turn government debt into a product. Instead of a simple loan, he bought government bonds at a discount and sold them to investors' insurance companies, pension funds, and aristocrats at a profit. He created a secondary market where debt could be traded like a commodity. If the British government needed money for war, they didn't have to beg individual merchants anymore. They went to Rothschild. He would provide the cash instantly, and then he would distribute the debt across his vast network of investors. But there was a catch. By controlling the supply of money to governments, Rothschild gained leverage over war and peace. The most famous example happened in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. The fate of Europe hung in the balance. If Napoleon won, British bonds would be worthless. If Britain won, they would be gold. Nathan Rothschild had a network of secret couriers and fast boats that brought him the news of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government knew. What did he do with this information? He went to the stock exchange and started selling British bonds. He dumped them. Everyone watching him thought, "Rothschild knows. Britain has lost." Panic swept the market. Investors sold everything they had. Prices crashed to the floor. And in that moment of total despair, Rothschild quietly bought up everything at pennies on the dollar. When the official news of victory arrived the next day, prices skyrocketed. In one single day, Nathan Rothschild multiplied his fortune not by working, but by manipulating the market using the debt system he controlled. This solidified the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the issuance of debt, and you control the government. But the most dangerous innovation was making debt international. Before this, if a king defaulted, he hurt local merchants. Now, a British bond might be owned by a French investor, used as collateral by a German bank to fund an Austrian project. The web was so tangled that if one country tried to default, it would crash the banking system of its neighbors. Rothschild made the debt trap inescapable because he made it systemic. No government could dare to walk away from its debt, because doing so would trigger a financial apocalypse that would destroy their own alliances. The chains were no longer just legal, they were structural. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschild family was wealthier than the kings they lent to, and every penny of that wealth came from the interest paid by taxpayers across Europe. They produced nothing. They built nothing. They simply owned the debt that nations required to survive. But across the ocean, a new giant was sleeping. The United States was growing, but its banking system was wild, chaotic, and decentralized. There was no central bank to enforce the trap. That was until the third architect, a man of immense power and terrifying gaze, decided that American freedom was bad for business. His name was J.P. Morgan. In the early 20th century, America was a financial Wild West. The economy was booming, factories were churning out steel and smoke, but the banking system was fragile. There was no central authority to force banks to cooperate. Money was tied to gold, which meant the supply was limited. Bankers hated limits. They wanted a system that could expand indefinitely, but they needed a crisis to justify it. And in 1907, they got one. The Panic of 1907 was a financial massacre. The stock market collapsed, falling 50% in a heartbeat. Banks across the nation started closing their doors. People lined up in the streets, desperate to withdraw their life savings, only to be told the vaults were empty. The entire American economy was on the precipice of a total dark age. There was only one man powerful enough to stop it: J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not just a banker. He was a force of nature. He was the man who financed the railroads, who created U.S. Steel, who bailed out the U.S. government itself during a previous crisis. When the Panic of 1907 hit, Morgan didn't ask for permission. He summoned the presidents of the major New York banks to his private library on Madison Avenue. He locked the heavy doors. With a cigar in one hand and the fate of the nation in the other, he told them a simple truth: no one leaves this room until you pledge your own capital to bail out the system. He forced them to cooperate. The panic ended. The market stabilized. J.P. Morgan was hailed as a hero. But Morgan knew something the public didn't. He was 70 years old. He wouldn't be around to stop the next panic. And more importantly, he didn't want to use his own money next time. He wanted to use yours. Morgan and his elite circle realized that to maintain their power, they needed a central bank. They needed a mechanism that could print money on demand to bail them out. A lender of last resort that had the full backing of the U.S. government but remained under their private control. There was just one problem. The American people hated central banks. They viewed them as tools of tyranny. The Founding Fathers had warned against them. Andrew Jackson had famously destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, calling it a hydra of corruption. If Morgan and his friends proposed a central bank, the public would revolt. Congress would never pass it. So, they decided to lie. They decided to engineer the most sophisticated deception in political history. In November 1910, a private train car with the blinds drawn left holding station in New Jersey. On board were 6 men. They carried no identification. They used code names. They told the press they were going on a duck hunting trip, but they weren't hunting ducks. They were hunting for a way to seize control of the American currency. Their destination was Jekyll Island, an exclusive, private club off the coast of Georgia owned by J.P. Morgan and his associates. For 9 days, in absolute secrecy, these men drafted the legislation that would become the Federal Reserve Act. Among them were Senator Nelson Aldrich, the political voice of the group, and Paul Warburg, a partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., who understood the European central banking model better than anyone. Warburg told them the secret to selling this to the American people. Don't call it a central bank. Call it a reserve system. Make it look decentralized. Make it look like the government is in charge. The structure they designed was a masterpiece of camouflage. It wouldn't be one bank in Washington. It would be 12 regional banks spread across the country. It would be overseen by a board appointed by the president to satisfy the politicians. But the real power, the power to set interest rates and buy bonds, would remain with the member banks, the private banks. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private shareholders, not the government. And the most powerful branch, the New York Fed, would be controlled by the very Wall Street giants that Morgan represented. They waited for the perfect moment to strike. They launched a propaganda campaign, claiming this new system would stop bank runs and protect the common man. In December 1913, while most of Congress was already home for the holidays or distracted by the upcoming break, the Federal Reserve Act was pushed through. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. Years later, Wilson would reportedly regret this moment, admitting, "I have unwittingly ruined my country." But for Morgan, who died earlier that same year, and his legacy, it was the ultimate victory. The third architect had completed his work. The trap was now infinite. Before 1913, the government could only borrow what banks had on hand. Gold was finite, but the Federal Reserve changed the laws of physics. Now, when the U.S. government needed money, it didn't have to rely on tax revenue or existing gold. It could issue a bond, an IOU, and the Federal Reserve would simply create the money to buy it. Where did the Fed get the money? From nowhere. They invented it. It was a bookkeeping entry. The government got the cash to spend on wars and welfare. The Fed got the bonds. And the banks that owned the Fed got a guaranteed stream of interest payments from the American taxpayer. This created a perpetual motion machine of debt. To keep the economy growing, the money supply had to expand. To expand the money supply, the government had to borrow more. If the government ever stopped borrowing, the money supply would shrink and the economy would crash. This is why the debt can never be paid off. It's not because politicians are irresponsible, though they are. It's because the system requires debt to exist. Every dollar in your pocket represents a dollar of debt owed by someone else. If all debts were paid off tomorrow, there would be no money left in circulation. Morgan's architecture ensured that the United States would be locked into a cycle of borrowing forever, turning the entire productivity of the nation into collateral for the bankers. By the mid-20th century, the trap that Patterson invented, Rothschild globalized, and Morgan legalized, was functioning perfectly in the developed world. But there was still a frontier left to conquer. The developing world. Countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa were rich in resources but poor in capital. They needed money to build dams, roads, and power plants. The bankers saw fresh prey. Throughout the 1,970 seconds, American and European banks flooded the developing world with cheap loans. They urged dictators and presidents to borrow massive amounts of dollars to modernize their nations. The interest rates were low, the terms were easy, and the money flowed like water. It felt like a party that would never end. But a trap isn't a trap until the door slams shut. And the man who slammed the door was the fourth architect. His name was Paul Volcker. In 1979, Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was a giant of a man, physically imposing, famously smoking cheap cigars and mumbling in a deep baritone. But he faced a crisis. The value of the U.S. dollar was collapsing. Inflation was running at over 10% a year. The oil crisis was hurting the economy. People were losing faith in paper money. The system that Morgan built was overheating. Volcker knew he had to save the dollar, no matter the cost. His solution was a sledgehammer. On a Saturday night in October 1979, Volcker announced a radical change in policy. He decided to restrict the money supply and let interest rates skyrocket. The prime rate, the rate banks charged their best customers, shot up to 21.5% by 1981. It was unprecedented shock therapy. For the average American, it meant mortgages were unaffordable and businesses went bankrupt. But for the developing nations that had borrowed billions in the 70 seconds, it was a death sentence. The shockwave from Volcker's interest rate hike hit the global economy like a tsunami. Developing nations, which had borrowed billions in dollars, suddenly found their payments tripling overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina owed $40 billion. The interest payments alone were now higher than the entire revenue generated by their exports. They were drowning. In August 1982, the finance minister of Mexico arrived in Washington, D.C., and dropped a bombshell. Mexico could no longer make its payments. They were defaulting. This moment should have been the end of the great banking empires. You see, the money Mexico had borrowed came largely from the biggest American banks: Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan. These banks had lent out more money than they actually had in capital. If Mexico defaulted, the Wall Street giants would collapse, dragging the entire U.S. economy down with them. Paul Volcker stood at a crossroads. He could have let the free market work. He could have let the banks take the loss for their reckless lending, but he didn't. Instead, he engineered the fourth and final wall of the debt trap. He organized a massive bailout, but not for Mexico. He used the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to bail out the American banks, using taxpayer money, while making it look like aid to the developing world. Here is how the Volcker innovation worked. The IMF would lend Mexico enough money to keep making its interest payments to Chase and Citibank. But this money came with strings attached, brutal, ironclad strings known as structural adjustment programs. In exchange for the loans, Mexico was forced to cut spending on healthcare and education, privatize its state-owned assets, and open its markets to foreign corporations. They effectively had to sell their national sovereignty to stay in the banking system. And the most diabolical part? The IMF loans didn't reduce the debt, they just refinanced it. They rolled the old unpayable debt into new, even larger debt, ensuring that Mexico would be paying interest forever. This turned debt from a financial instrument into a tool of geopolitical control. When a country cannot pay, you don't forgive the debt, you restructure it, you own them. This pattern has been repeated with ruthless efficiency for 40 years. We saw it in Argentina in 2001, we saw it in Greece in 2010, we saw it in Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the story is the same. The IMF steps in, austerity is imposed, national assets are sold off to foreign investors at fire sale prices, and the debt is never, ever eliminated. It is made perpetual. Volcker died in 2019, hailed as the man who killed inflation, but his real legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when you go bankrupt, you are not allowed to leave the casino. Now, step back and look at the whole machine. The blueprint is complete. First, William Patterson, 1694, proved that government debt shouldn't be repaid but should generate interest forever. Second, Nathan Rothschild, 1815, turned that debt into a globally tradable commodity, creating a web so complex that default became systemic suicide. Third, J.P. Morgan, 1913, created the Federal Reserve, a central bank that could print infinite money to buy infinite debt, ensuring the government never runs out of lenders. And fourth, Paul Volcker, 1982, enforced the rule that no one is allowed to escape. If you can't pay, your nation is stripped for parts, but the interest must flow. The result is the world we live in today. A world crushed under $315 trillion of global debt. None of it will ever be repaid. It mathematically cannot be repaid. And here is the specific, terrifying mechanism of the American debt trap that explains why your cost of living keeps rising while the elite keep getting richer. The United States government currently owes $38 trillion. Who owns this debt? About $20 trillion is held by the public pension funds, insurance companies, banks, and mutual funds. They buy treasury bonds because they are sold as safe assets, but these bonds pay interest roughly $1 trillion a year now. Where does that money come from? It comes from your taxes. So, every year, the government takes $1 trillion of hard-earned money from workers and transfers it directly to the bondholders. Since the vast majority of financial assets are owned by the top 10% of the population, this is effectively a massive, automated wealth transfer from the working class to the asset-owning class. It is not a tax for services, it is a tribute payment. The other $18 trillion is owed by the government to itself, specifically to the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. The government raided these funds, spent the money, and replaced it with IOUs. This is a shell game. When the time comes to pay out those benefits to you, the government will have to either raise taxes massively or print trillions more dollars, devaluing your savings even further. And this leads us to the final, ultimate truth that they desperately don't want you to understand. Why don't they just pay it off? If the US is so rich, why carry 38 trillion in debt? The answer is that the debt is the money. Under the Federal Reserve System, money is only created when debt is issued. If the US government paid off its debt tomorrow, if it paid back every bond, the money supply would vanish. There would be no dollars in circulation. The economy would instantly collapse into a deflationary black hole. Therefore, the debt must grow. It is a structural necessity. For the economy to expand, the debt must expand. For you to have money in your pocket, the government must be in the red. They have built a system where prosperity is chained to insolvency. This is why politicians never cut spending. This is why the debt ceiling is always raised. It's all theater. They have no choice. The machine Morgan and Patterson built requires infinite fuel. So, who wins? The institutions that sit at the top of the pyramid. The asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who manage tens of trillions. They hold the bonds. They collect the interest. They use the debt as collateral to leverage more power. For them, 38 trillion isn't a crisis. It's a business model. It's the greatest rental property in history, and the tenant is the entire human race. Every hour you work, every dollar you save, a fraction of it is being siphoned off to service this architectural monstrosity. Interest is the rent we pay to live in their world. And as long as we believe that this is just how the economy works, as long as we think debt is just an unfortunate accident of bad policy, the trap remains secure. But now, you see the blueprints. You see the four architects, Patterson, Rothschild, Morgan, Volcker. They didn't conspire in a dark room together. They built upon each other's work across centuries to construct a prison without bars. A system where nations are sovereign in name only, and where the true power lies with those who hold the ledger. The $38 trillion debt is not a mistake. It is the foundation. It is the feature, not the bug. And an escape is not possible without collapsing the entire financial civilization they have built. But knowledge is the first step towards freedom. If this video changed how you see the money in your wallet, if it made you realize that the game is rigged from the very first rule, then you are starting to wake up. Don't just get angry. Get prepared. Because a system built on infinite debt cannot last forever in a finite world. The cracks are showing. The math is breaking. And when the music finally stops, you need to be the one holding real assets, not their paper promises. Subscribe to this channel if you want to know what happens next, because the history books won't tell you, and the news certainly won't warn you. We are decoding the pattern, one piece at a time. The architects built the trap, but we are finding the way out.